Karen Wallace was a senior flight attendant who thought she had everything under control. She enforced the rules, kept order on flights, and never questioned the way she treated passengers. Until the day she met Marcus Johnson. When a well-dressed black man took his seat in first class, Karen immediately doubted he belonged there. She questioned him, dismissed his proof, and pushed too far until she discovered the shocking truth. She had just humiliated a senior board member of the very airline she worked for. But that was only the beginning. As the flight prepared for takeoff, a real emergency forced everyone to see who truly belonged in control. And when the truth came out, Karen's entire career and everything she thought she knew came crashing down. Would she lose everything? Or would she find a way to redeem herself before it was too late? Stay tuned to find out. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers all around the world. The airport buzzed with travelers, their conversations blending into a constant hum. Marcus Johnson adjusted his cufflinks as he walked toward the boarding gate, his polished black leather shoes clicking against the floor. He had flown countless times before, but today's flight felt different. He was heading home after years of working abroad, and he was ready to finally enjoy some peace. The gate attendant checked his ticket and nodded with a polite smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Johnson," she said. With a slight nod of gratitude, Marcus stepped onto the jet bridge, breathing in the familiar scent of circulated air. As he entered the first-class cabin, he glanced at his seat. Two-way, window seat, premium comfort. He was ready to settle in. But then came the voice. "Excuse me, sir," a woman called out sharply. Marcus turned. Standing before him was a blonde flight attendant with a stiff posture and a forced smile. Her name tag read Karen Wallace. "First class is reserved for premium passengers," she said, her eyes scanning him like he didn't belong. Marcus frowned. He remained calm, though a flicker of irritation crossed his mind. "That's correct," he replied, pulling out his ticket. "I believe my seat is right here." Karen took the ticket, barely glancing at it before crossing her arms. "There must be a mistake," she said. "You should check your boarding pass again." A murmur rippled through the surrounding passengers. Some turned their heads, sensing tension brewing. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I booked this seat weeks ago. There is no mistake." Karen hesitated, then glanced toward a nearby white man wearing sweatpants and an old hoodie who had just taken his seat in first class. She had not stopped him. She had not questioned him. That was when Marcus understood. "This isn't about my ticket, is it?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Sir, I need to verify your seat. Please step aside." Marcus exhaled slowly. He was used to situations like this. But today, he had neither the patience nor the willingness to tolerate such treatment. Another flight attendant, a young woman with dark hair, stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. "Karen's ticket is valid," she said quietly. "There's no issue." Karen ignored her. "We need further verification." A man in a suit, the flight manager, approached. "What's going on here?" Karen pointed at Marcus. "He might be in the wrong section." The flight manager barely looked at Marcus before nodding. "Let's check his details to be sure." Marcus sighed, reached into his briefcase, and pulled out something, not another ticket, but a sleek, engraved business card. "Here," he said, handing it to the flight manager. The man took one glance at it, and then his expression changed instantly. His face turned pale. His posture stiffened. He swallowed hard. Karen, sensing something was wrong, peeked at the card. Her eyes widened in shock. Marcus Johnson, board member and senior investor, Aerosky Airlines. Silence hung in the air like a storm cloud. The owner of the airline, or at least a man with enough power to fire her on the spot, was standing right in front of her. And she had just humiliated him. Karen blinked rapidly, struggling for words. I had no idea," she stammered. Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice dangerously calm. "Well, he said. Now you do. The entire first-class cabin had fallen completely silent. Every pair of eyes was on Karen. But before she could scramble for an excuse, the speakers crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor delay due to a technical issue. Please remain seated as we conduct a quick safety check. The pilot's voice sounded calm, but Marcus noticed something in his tone. It wasn't just a routine announcement. Something was wrong. And soon, everyone on this plane, including Karen, would wish they had treated him differently. A strange tension hung in the air. Passengers murmured, shifting in their seats as the announcement replayed over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor delay due to a technical issue. Please remain seated as we conduct a quick safety check. Marcus Johnson narrowed his eyes. Something about the pilot's tone unsettled him. Airlines rarely admitted to technical issues unless there was real trouble. Karen, still visibly shaken after discovering Marcus's true identity, clung to the illusion of control. She cleared her throat and forced a smile. Everything is fine, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be taking off shortly, she announced, her voice lacking its earlier confidence. Marcus didn't believe her. He had spent years in the aviation industry, working with top engineers and pilots. Technical delays were either minor or catastrophic. There was rarely an in-between. He leaned slightly toward the flight manager, who was still holding his business card with stiff fingers. What kind of issue are we dealing with? Marcus asked. The flight manager hesitated. I'm not sure. They haven't told us much. Marcus frowned. That was another red flag. Pilots always informed the crew about technical delays. Then, something else caught his attention. The lead pilot was exiting the cockpit. Pilots rarely left the cockpit before takeoff, especially during an active delay. Yet here he was, a middle-aged man with silver-streaked hair and a tense expression, walking briskly toward the galley. Marcus wasn't the only one who noticed. The young flight attendant who had tried to defend Marcus earlier stepped toward the pilot and whispered something. The pilot shook his head, looking grim. Then, their eyes met Marcus's. A flicker of recognition crossed the pilot's face. He turned toward Marcus and approached, his steps firm but controlled. When he spoke, his voice was low and urgent. Mr. Johnson. Marcus was taken aback. You know me? The pilot gave a small nod. I've read about your work. We met at an aviation safety conference in D.C. 3 years ago. I didn't expect to see you on this flight. Marcus's mind worked quickly. If this pilot recognized him and was coming to him directly, that meant one thing. This was serious. The pilot exhaled. Listen, I don't want to cause panic, but we have a problem. And you're one of the few people on this plane who might understand it. Karen's face twisted with disbelief. Excuse me? He's just a passenger, she interrupted, still desperate to assert control. Why are you telling him this? The pilot didn't even look at her. Because Marcus Johnson is one of the top aviation safety specialists in the country, he said, his tone sharp. And right now I could use his expertise. Karen's mouth snapped shut. Marcus stood, his instincts kicking in. What's going on? He asked, voice steady. The pilot glanced at the passengers, then lowered his voice. We've detected an issue with the hydraulic system. Marcus's stomach tightened. How bad? The pilot's face was grim. The primary system failed. The backup is holding, but it's unstable. If we take off and the backup fails too, we'll have no control over the landing gear. Karen let out a nervous laugh. That sounds manageable, right? The pilot finally turned to her, his patience clearly wearing thin. Miss Wallace, he said, voice clipped. If the backup system fails midair, we won't be able to lower the landing gear or control the flaps. That means we won't be able to land properly. Karen paled. Marcus didn't waste time. You need a second opinion on the system before we risk taking off. The pilot nodded. That's why I came to you. Marcus was already moving toward the cockpit when Karen grabbed his arm. You can't just go into the cockpit, she protested. That's against regulations. Marcus gave her a long, measured look. I own a percentage of this airline. I helped develop safety protocols for this aircraft model. And if I don't check that system, this plane might not land in one piece. He pulled his arm free. Now get out of my way. Karen stepped back, speechless. The first-class cabin was dead silent. Every passenger was watching. Marcus turned to the pilot. Let's go. Together, they walked toward the cockpit. Whatever was happening, Marcus was about to find out. The cockpit door slid shut behind Marcus and the pilot, sealing them off from the rest of the plane. The hum of the aircraft's systems filled the small space, punctuated by the occasional beep of warning indicators. Marcus immediately noticed the flashing amber light on the control panel, a hydraulic system alert. The co-pilot, a younger man with sharp features and tense shoulders, turned his head sharply. His face lit up with recognition. Wait, Marcus Johnson, he asked, almost in disbelief. The aviation safety consultant? Marcus gave a brief nod. That's me. Let's skip the introductions. Tell me exactly what we're dealing with. The captain, still visibly tense, motioned toward the control panel. Primary hydraulic failure. Backup system is functioning, but we're getting fluctuating pressure readings. Marcus took a deep breath. Hydraulics were the lifeblood of an aircraft. They controlled the landing gear, flaps, and brakes. If both systems failed, the plane would have no way to land safely. He leaned over the controls, scanning the diagnostic readings. The numbers didn't look good. Have you tried resetting the backup system? Marcus asked. The co-pilot shook his head. We haven't. We were debating whether we should, but if we cycle the system and it fails, Marcus finished his thought, then you might lose the last functioning hydraulics altogether. The cockpit fell silent for a second. The aircraft was still parked at the gate, but time was running out. If they waited too long, they would have to deplane everyone and cancel the flight. Marcus turned to the captain. What's your gut feeling? If we take off with the system as it is, what are the odds we make a safe landing? The captain exhaled. I don't like the odds. Marcus nodded. Then let's not take chances. We need to inspect the hydraulic system manually. The co-pilot's brow furrowed. You mean check the external lines? Yes, Marcus said. But first we need to test something. He moved swiftly to the hydraulic override panel, a feature most passengers didn't know existed. He flipped a series of switches, initiating a manual pressure test. The result was immediate. A red warning light blinked furiously. Marcus's stomach dropped. That meant only one thing. This isn't just a failing system, he murmured. This is a progressive leak. The captain's face darkened. Are you saying that even if the backup system holds for now, we could lose hydraulics? Mid-flight? Marcus nodded. And if that happens while we're landing at high speed, the gear might collapse. That would turn this plane into a 90-ton sled with no brakes. The co-pilot swore under his breath. Then we can't take off. The captain reached for the radio to call ground control. But before he could, a voice interrupted them. You're not seriously listening to him, are you? Marcus turned around. Karen was standing at the cockpit door. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was somewhere between defiance and desperation. This man isn't even a pilot, she scoffed. How do you know he's not exaggerating? Maybe he just wants to look important. Marcus's patience was wearing thin. I helped design the safety systems for this aircraft model, he said, voice controlled. I know this plane better than you ever will. Karen wasn't ready to back down. And yet I don't see anyone else panicking. If it were that serious, wouldn't we have heard more alarms? Wouldn't the maintenance team have caught it? Marcus studied her for a second. She wasn't just stubborn, she was desperate to regain control of the situation after humiliating herself in first class. He exhaled. Let me put this in terms you'll understand, he said. Imagine you're driving a car and your brakes feel soft. You can still stop, but not as quickly. Then a warning light comes on saying your brake fluid is low. Do you keep driving, hoping the brakes don't fail, or B, pull over and fix the problem before you crash? Karen hesitated. Marcus leaned in slightly. Because right now you're telling me we should just keep driving. Silence. Then a voice crackled over the radio. Captain, this is maintenance. We've just checked the hydraulic lines externally. You were right. We found a slow but steady leak near the nose gear actuator. The co-pilot cursed under his breath. The captain's face hardened. We're grounding the flight, the captain announced. Karen visibly deflated. The announcement was made moments later. Attention, passengers. Due to a critical maintenance issue, Flight 226 will not be departing today. Please remain seated as we prepare for deplaning procedures. A collective groan rippled through the cabin, but Marcus knew it was far better than the alternative. He had just prevented a potential disaster. As the captain and co-pilot handled the next steps, Marcus stepped out of the cockpit and was immediately met with dozens of eyes staring at him. Passengers whispered, glancing at him with a mix of curiosity and relief. Karen, still standing near the cockpit door, looked like she wanted to disappear. Then, the CEO of Aerosky Airlines appeared. He had been sitting in first class the entire time. Karen's face turned white. Marcus, the CEO said, shaking his head with a small smile. I had no idea you were on board, but I'm damn glad you were. Karen took a step back. The CEO's gaze landed directly on her. I just heard what happened, he said coldly, and I think we need to have a conversation. Karen visibly gulped. And Marcus? He simply walked past her, back to his seat, as the reality of her mistake finally sank in. Karen's breath came in shallow bursts as the CEO of Aerosky Airlines stared her down. The bustling energy inside the first-class cabin had shifted. There was no more whispering, no more murmuring passengers. Now everyone was waiting. The reality of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. She had humiliated Marcus Johnson, a senior board member of the very airline she worked for. She had tried to undermine his authority in front of the entire crew. And worst of all, she had argued against grounding a flight with a real safety issue, something that could have ended in disaster. This wasn't just a mistake. This was career suicide. Karen Wallace, the CEO finally said, his voice calm but razor-sharp. Walk with me. Karen hesitated. Sir, that wasn't a request. Her legs felt like lead as she followed him down the aisle. Marcus was already back in his seat, watching with unreadable eyes. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her. As they stepped into the front galley, the CEO turned to face her. Do you have any idea what you've done? He asked. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. The CEO's jaw tightened. You stopped a paying first-class passenger from taking his seat. You argued against a safety expert, someone who literally helped design our aircraft safety protocols. And worst of all, you tried to override the captain's authority in a crisis. Karen swallowed. I didn't know who he was. The CEO scoffed. That's your excuse? So if you were just an ordinary passenger, this would have been okay? Karen felt her stomach drop. That's not what I meant, she stammered. Then tell me, the CEO said, stepping closer. If Marcus hadn't been on this flight, would you have still pushed for takeoff? Karen froze, because she knew the answer. And from the look in the CEO's eyes, so did he. The CEO took a deep breath, clearly holding back his frustration. I should fire you on the spot, he said. Karen flinched. I have enough grounds to do it. Hell, I should have done it the second I saw that footage. Karen's head snapped up. Footage. The CEO smirked. The cockpit cameras record audio, Karen. We heard every word. Karen's vision blurred with panic. But, the CEO continued, firing you right now would be too easy. Karen blinked, confused. Too easy? The CEO folded his arms. You humiliated a senior board member in front of an entire plane full of passengers. I could fire you right here, right now. But then what? You go online, play the victim, say you were treated unfairly? No, that's not how this is going to end. Karen's skin prickled with dread. We're not firing you, the CEO said. Not yet. Karen exhaled in shaky relief until he spoke again. You're going to stand in front of this entire plane and apologize. Her relief vanished. Karen's legs felt weak as she followed the CEO back to first class. Marcus was still in his seat, arms crossed, watching silently. The pilot and crew stood nearby, waiting, and every passenger was listening. The CEO nodded at her. Well, go ahead. Karen's throat was dry. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to melt into the floor and never be seen again. But there was no way out of this. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. I want to apologize, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Louder, the CEO ordered. Karen's face burned. She cleared her throat. I want to apologize, she repeated, voice shaking. To Mr. Johnson and to the crew. I acted unprofessionally, and I take full responsibility. Silence. Then Marcus spoke. Tell me, he said, his voice calm. What exactly are you apologizing for? Karen hesitated. She knew what he wanted. He didn't want a vague, forced apology. He wanted her to say it. Karen's nails dug into her palms. I judged you unfairly. I assumed you didn't belong in first class. And I didn't listen when you tried to help. Marcus held her gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he nodded. Accepted, he said. Karen almost collapsed with relief. The CEO wasn't finished. You're grounded, he told her. Effective immediately. Karen's head shot up. But no flights. No customer interactions. You're on probation, the CEO said firmly. And you'll undergo mandatory retraining in passenger relations and safety protocol. Karen's stomach churned. For how long? The CEO smirked. That depends. How long does it take to fix an attitude? As the CEO turned away, Marcus stood up, buttoning his jacket. Mr. Johnson, Karen blurted, desperate for some kind of redemption. I really am sorry. Marcus studied her for a moment, then gave a small smile. I hope you are, he said, because the next time you judge someone too quickly, you might not be lucky enough to walk away with just an apology. Karen swallowed hard. Marcus turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in front of the entire cabin exposed, humiliated and utterly defeated. The CEO gave the final announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay, he said. We are arranging for a replacement aircraft to ensure your safe departure. We appreciate your patience. As passengers began gathering their belongings, one thing was clear. Marcus Johnson had walked onto this plane as just another passenger. But he was walking off as the man who had saved the flight, humbled a power-hungry employee, and earned the respect of everyone on board. Karen stood frozen in the aisle, her pulse pounding in her ears. The CEO's words still rang in her head. You're grounded. How long does it take to fix an attitude? Passengers continued gathering their belongings as the airline staff directed them toward the jet bridge. Some shot Karen pitying glances. Others didn't bother hiding their satisfaction. She felt exposed, stripped of authority, humiliated. But as much as she hated it, she knew one thing. She wasn't fired. Not yet. This was her last chance. As Karen stepped off the plane, the CEO walked ahead, talking with Marcus Johnson. She trailed behind, her mind racing. Mandatory retraining? Probation? How was she supposed to fix this? She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice the young flight attendant who had defended Marcus earlier, Emily. If Karen remembered correctly, waiting just outside the jet bridge. Karen slowed, expecting hostility. But Emily just sighed, arms crossed. That was painful to watch, she said. Karen tensed. If you're here to rub it in, Emily shook her head. Relax. I'm not like you. Karen's jaw clenched. Emily studied her, then exhaled. Look, I'll be honest. I don't like the way you treat people. But I also don't think you're stupid. You've been with this airline for years. If you were completely incompetent, you'd be gone by now." Karen didn't know whether to feel insulted or relieved. Emily continued, lowering her voice. "This is your last shot, Karen. They won't give you another one. You need to fix this fast." Karen swallowed. "How?" she asked, surprising herself. Emily hesitated, then looked toward Marcus, who was still talking to the CEO near the terminal lounge. "Start with him," she said. Karen felt a cold weight settle in her chest. Marcus Johnson, the man she had tried to kick off the plane, the man who had just saved that same plane, the man who now had every reason to ensure she never flew again. Approaching him felt impossible. But Karen knew the truth. If she didn't fix this, her career was over. Karen's hands trembled as she crossed the terminal. Marcus was finishing his conversation with the CEO when she stopped a few feet away. He noticed her immediately. For a second, she thought he might ignore her completely. But then, he raised an eyebrow waiting. Karen took a shaky breath. "Mr. Johnson, do you have a moment?" The CEO glanced between them, then nodded at Marcus. "I'll catch up with you later." He patted Marcus on the back and walked off, leaving them alone. Marcus folded his arms. "What can I do for you, Miss Wallace?" Karen hated how calm he was, how controlled, how powerful. She had spent years commanding passengers, giving orders, being in control. Now, she was the one asking for mercy. Karen hesitated, forcing herself to look him in the eyes. "I need your help." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "That's new." Karen's face burned, but she pushed forward. "I know I messed up. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about the flight. I was wrong about a lot of things." Marcus said nothing, just watching her. Karen forced herself to continue. "The CEO is making me go through retraining. But let's be honest, if you tell him I'm a lost cause, I'm done. No one in this airline will ever take me seriously again." Marcus studied her for a long moment. "And why should I help you?" Karen didn't have a good answer. She had never cared about Marcus Johnson before today. In fact, if she hadn't been caught, she wouldn't have given him a second thought. But now, she needed him. She swallowed hard. "Because I want to change." For the first time since she started speaking, Marcus's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something unreadable. "Do you?" he asked. Karen nodded quickly. "Yes." Marcus exhaled. "Let me ask you something, Karen." She stiffened. "If today never happened," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm, "would you still want to change?" Karen froze, because deep down she knew the answer. She had never questioned her behavior before. Never thought twice about who she dismissed, who she judged, who she treated as less than. She had only wanted to change now because she had been caught. Her silence was the answer. Marcus sighed. "That's what I thought." Karen panicked. "Wait." But Marcus was already turning away. And as he walked off, leaving her standing there alone, Karen realized something terrifying. Maybe she was already too late. Karen stood frozen in the middle of the terminal, watching Marcus Johnson disappear into the crowd. Her stomach twisted. She had done what she thought was the hardest part, swallowing her pride, admitting she was wrong, asking for help. But it hadn't been enough, because Marcus had seen through her. And the worst part? He was right. If today hadn't happened, if she hadn't been humiliated in front of an entire plane, if Marcus hadn't turned out to be someone powerful, would she have cared? Would she have changed at all? Karen felt sick. She had always thought of herself as someone who followed the rules, who kept order on flights, who did her job well. But today had forced her to see herself through someone else's eyes. Through the eyes of the passengers she had ignored. Through the eyes of her own coworkers, who had seen her behavior but never spoken up. Through the eyes of a man she had disrespected, dismissed, and underestimated. And for the first time in her career, Karen had to face an uncomfortable truth. She wasn't the good guy in this story. Karen didn't know how long she stood there before her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Emily, coworker. Karen hesitated, then answered. Hello. Emily's voice was neutral. Meet me in the training center. Now. Before Karen could respond, Emily hung up. Karen exhaled, rubbing her temple. This day wasn't over yet. 15 minutes later, Karen stepped into the airline's training center, a sleek, glass-walled building connected to the main terminal. Emily was waiting for her near a row of training simulators, mock airplane cabins, used to teach new flight attendants. Karen crossed her arms. Why did you call me here? Emily gestured to a row of seats. Sit. Karen hesitated. Emily sighed. Do you want to fix this or not? Grinding her teeth, Karen sat down. Emily pulled out a tablet and tapped the screen. We're going to go over something very simple. A video played. Karen's own voice echoed through the room. You should check your boarding pass again. Are you sure you're in the right section? I need further verification. It was her interaction with Marcus, recorded from the cockpit's audio system. Karen's stomach dropped. She had known the CEO had listened to it, but hearing it herself was different. It wasn't just her words, it was her tone. Dismissing, belittling, certain she was right. Emily paused the video. Do you hear it now? Karen swallowed hard. Emily didn't let her finish. Every single time he gave you proof, you moved the goalpost, she said. Every time he told you the truth, you looked for another reason to doubt him. Karen's nails dug into her palms. Emily crossed her arms. And let me guess, if he hadn't been a board member, you wouldn't have thought twice about what you did. Karen wanted to deny it, wanted to defend herself. But she couldn't, because it was true. Emily let the silence hang between them. Then she tapped the screen again. A new video started. Karen frowned. This one wasn't from today. It was an old security recording from another flight, a woman in a navy blue flight attendant uniform standing in the aisle, talking to a passenger. Karen's breath caught. It was her, and she was doing the exact same thing, questioning a black man about his seat, demanding unnecessary verification, acting like she knew better. Karen's throat tightened. She had no memory of this moment, because for her, it had been just another day. But for that passenger, it had been a moment he never forgot. Karen felt sick. Emily locked eyes with her. This isn't about Marcus Johnson. This is about a pattern. Karen couldn't argue, because for the first time, she saw it. And she hated what she saw. Emily sat back. So, what now? Karen swallowed. I don't know. Emily studied her. Do you actually want to change? Or do you just want to fix your image? Karen looked down at her hands. For the first time, she wasn't sure. But then she thought about Marcus. How calm he had been. How he had seen through her excuses. And yet, he hadn't been cruel. He had been firm, honest, unapologetic. And despite everything, he had left the door open for her to make the right choice. Karen took a shaky breath. I don't want to be that person anymore, she admitted. I just don't know how to fix it. Emily considered her for a long moment. Then, she slid her a folder. Karen frowned, opening it. Inside was a schedule. A full month of intensive training. Not just on customer service, but on bias recognition, conflict resolution, and leadership accountability. Karen looked up, startled. This isn't standard retraining. Emily smirked. Nope. The CEO wants to see if you can actually learn from this. If you can't, you're gone. Karen swallowed. This wasn't just retraining. This was a test. Her final chance. Karen closed the folder, gripping it tightly. Emily raised an eyebrow. Well? Karen took a deep breath. Then, for the first time in a long time, she said something without hesitation. When do we start? Karen sat stiffly in the training center, staring at the schedule in front of her. 1 month. 4 weeks of intensive retraining that would determine whether she still had a future in the airline industry or if her career was permanently over. Her stomach churned. Across from her, Emily leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. I have to admit I didn't think you'd actually go through with it. Karen exhaled slowly. Neither did I. Emily smirked. Well, congratulations. You're officially the most senior flight attendant in company history to be forced back into entry-level training. Karen shot her a glare, but she couldn't argue with the truth. The first day of training felt like stepping into a time machine. Karen had worked for the airline for 8 years. She had trained new hires before. She had given lectures on airline policies, customer service, and emergency protocols. Now, she was back in a room full of trainees, sitting among fresh-faced recruits who hadn't even flown their first flight. Karen felt out of place. And when the lead instructor, a sharp-eyed woman named Denise, called her out in front of everyone, that feeling only got worse. Karen Wallace, Denise read from a clipboard. 12 years of flight experience. Previous senior flight attendant. The room shifted uncomfortably. Some of the trainees whispered. They knew who she was. Denise raised an eyebrow. Why are you here? Karen's throat tightened. She felt every pair of eyes on her, but she refused to shrink. I'm here because I need to be, Karen said, keeping her voice steady. I have things to learn. Denise studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Good. Let's see if that's true. The session focused on bias recognition, the very thing Karen had failed at. Denise put up an image on the projector. It showed 3 passengers boarding a plane, a young woman in business attire, an elderly man in casual clothes, and a muscular man with tattoos wearing a hoodie. Denise turned to the class. Who do you think is flying first class? Karen knew the trap immediately. She had spent years making assumptions based on appearance. And now, she was sitting in a room full of people learning not to make the same mistakes. A young recruit raised his hand. The businesswoman? Denise nodded. That's what most people assume. But the reality? All 3 are flying first class. Karen swallowed hard. Denise's gaze flicked to her. Karen, what's the lesson here? Karen exhaled. You can't assume someone's status based on how they look. Denise smiled. Exactly. Karen felt a twinge of something unexpected. Not just embarrassment, but recognition. During the break, Karen was pouring herself coffee when Denise approached. You handled that better than I expected, Denise said. Karen smirked. Is that a compliment? Denise shrugged. It's an observation. Karen sipped her coffee. How long have you been an instructor? 5 years. Denise leaned against the counter. Before that, I was a flight attendant, just like you. Karen glanced at her. Then you know how easy it is to slip into patterns. Denise's expression softened. Yeah, I do. That's why I left. Karen frowned. Left. Denise sighed. I caught myself making the same mistakes you did. I had 2 choices, either keep pretending I was right or start over. Karen swallowed. So I started over, Denise continued. And now I make sure no one else goes down that road. Karen hesitated, then asked, Do you think people can actually change? Denise smirked. That depends. Are you here to change? Or are you here to survive? Karen didn't have an answer. Not yet. Later that evening, Karen sat alone in the training center's lounge, staring at her schedule. Day 1 was over. 29 days to go. She rubbed her temples. Could she actually do this? A voice interrupted her thoughts. You look deep in thought. Karen looked up and froze. Marcus Johnson was standing in the doorway. Her stomach dropped. What are you doing here? She blurted. Marcus smirked. Checking on an investment. Karen frowned. Investment? Marcus walked over and sat across from her. I talked to the CEO today. He told me about your training. He also told me I had the option to permanently block you from returning to active flight duty. Karen's breath caught. And? Marcus shrugged. I told him I'd wait and see. Karen's pulse pounded. You're watching me? Marcus's smirk faded. I'm watching to see if you actually learn. Karen swallowed. And if I don't? Marcus's eyes hardened. Then I make sure you never wear that uniform again. Karen felt the weight of those words. Marcus wasn't threatening her. He was giving her a choice. A real one. Karen clenched her fists. This wasn't just about her career anymore. It was about who she was going to be. She looked Marcus in the eye. Then I guess I'd better start learning. For the first time, Marcus smiled. Good answer. Karen had never worked harder in her life. Day after day, she sat through hours of bias recognition, crisis management, and leadership accountability training. She forced herself to listen, to confront the ugly truths she had ignored for years. And every day, she felt Marcus's presence. He never interrupted her training, never challenged her openly. But he was always there, checking in with the CEO, speaking with the instructors, watching, waiting. He wasn't looking for improvement. He was looking for proof. Karen knew it, and it was exhausting. By the third week, Karen thought she was making progress. She answered correctly in training sessions. She asked thoughtful questions. She tried. But then came the simulation. Denise, the lead instructor, gathered the trainees inside a mock airplane cabin, designed to test how they handled real-life scenarios. We're running a role play today, Denise announced. You'll be assigned different passengers. Your job is to handle them appropriately. Karen exhaled. She could do this. Then Denise handed her a scenario card. Karen's fingers tensed. Passenger 14A, an African-American man in first class. Confident demeanor. Challenges authority. Appears wealthier than expected. Karen's stomach dropped. It was her exact situation with Marcus. She looked up, sharply at Denise, whose expression gave nothing away. This isn't a coincidence, is it? Karen asked. Denise just smiled. Let's see what you've learned. The simulation began. An instructor, playing the role of passenger 14A, sat in first class, legs crossed, reading a newspaper. Karen swallowed hard, stepping toward him. She forced a smile. Good evening, sir. May I see your boarding pass? The passenger didn't look up. Why? Karen hesitated. She knew what she would have said before training. She knew the Karen from a month ago would have automatically questioned him, assumed he was in the wrong seat. But that wasn't who she wanted to be. Karen took a slow breath. I'm just here to welcome you, she said, forcing her tone to stay warm, not defensive. If there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable, let me know. The passenger lowered the newspaper. He studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. You've changed. Karen's breath hitched. Because it wasn't just any instructor. It was Marcus. Karen froze. Her entire body tensed as Marcus set the newspaper down and leaned forward slightly. What's wrong, Karen? He asked, his voice low, measured. You were handling things so well. Karen's mind raced. This was a test. A final test. Marcus wasn't here as an observer anymore. He was part of the evaluation. Karen swallowed. You planned this, didn't you? Marcus tilted his head. Denise asked if I wanted to see your progress firsthand. I said yes. Karen's hands clenched. And if I fail? Marcus didn't blink. Then we both know you haven't changed. The pressure was suffocating. Karen wanted to walk away. Wanted to say this wasn't fair. That this test was cruel. That no one should have to prove themselves like this. But then she thought about all the passengers she had treated like Marcus before today. Passengers who had never been given the benefit of the doubt. Passengers who had been judged before they even sat down. She took a deep breath. And she made a choice. Karen straightened. I was wrong about you, she said simply. And not just you. I was wrong about a lot of things. Marcus's expression remained unreadable. Go on. Karen exhaled. I spent years thinking I was just doing my job. That I was keeping order, following protocol, maintaining control. But the truth is, I was using those rules as a shield. Marcus nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. I use them to justify why I dismissed people so quickly, why I assumed I knew better, why I never stopped to consider how my actions affected others. Karen clenched her fists, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I can't undo the things I've done, she admitted, and I won't stand here and beg for you to believe I've changed. She took a slow, steady breath. But I am changing, and whether you believe me or not, I'm going to keep doing the work. Silence filled the cabin. Karen's heart pounded as she waited for Marcus's response. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his seat and smiled. Marcus stood. Simulation over. Karen's chest tightened as he turned toward Denise. Well, he asked. Denise tapped her pen against her clipboard. She passed. Karen exhaled sharply, barely believing what she had heard. But before relief could fully settle in, Marcus turned back to her. This wasn't about passing a test, Karen, he said. This was about proving that, when under pressure, you wouldn't fall back into old habits. Karen swallowed. And did I? Marcus studied her. Then, finally, he nodded. No, he said. You didn't. That night, as Karen packed up her training materials, she felt different. For the first time, this wasn't about keeping her job. It wasn't about surviving probation. It was about who she was going to be moving forward. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. Tomorrow, 7 a.m. CEO's office. Final decision. Karen took a deep breath. Tomorrow, she would learn if she had earned back her career. But for the first time, it wasn't the only thing that mattered. Because whether or not she got her job back, she was going to keep doing the work. Karen barely slept. By the time 6:45 a.m. rolled around, she was already sitting outside the CEO's office, gripping a coffee cup she had no intention of drinking. The past month had been the hardest of her career. But this was it. The final moment. Her fate was about to be decided. She glanced at the wall clock. 6:59 a.m. And then, right on cue, the door opened. The CEO of Aerosky Airlines, Robert Langston, stood behind his desk, arms crossed. He was a tall, silver-haired man with a piercing gaze that never seemed to miss a detail. Across from him sat Marcus Johnson. Karen's chest tightened. Langston gestured toward a chair. Sit. She did. The room was silent. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the city outside the high-rise windows. Then Langston spoke. You've completed your training. Karen nodded. Yes, sir. Langston leaned back. And, do you think you've changed? Karen hesitated. She had expected this question, but she wouldn't make the mistake of giving the easy answer. I think I've started to, she admitted. But I also know change isn't something you prove in a month. It's something you prove every day. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Langston studied her. Tell me what you learned. Karen swallowed. That I had a pattern, she said. That I judged people too quickly, convinced myself I was right, and used rules as an excuse for why I treated people differently. Langston's gaze didn't waver. And why does that matter? Karen exhaled. Because my job isn't just about enforcing policies. It's about people. A pause. Langston glanced at Marcus. And then, to Karen's shock, Marcus spoke. I've been watching her, Marcus said simply. Karen, I've spoken to her instructors, reviewed her evaluations, and yesterday I put her through a test myself. Langston raised an eyebrow. And? Marcus leaned forward slightly. She didn't fall back into old habits. Karen's heart pounded. Langston considered this. Then he turned back to her. One last question, he said. Why should I trust you to wear our uniform again? Karen took a steady breath. Because I'm not the same person who wore it before, she said. Langston was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. You're reinstated. Karen's breath caught. She, after everything, after nearly losing everything, she had earned her place back. Langston stood. Effective immediately, you're back on the roster. But understand this. Karen, there's no more room for mistakes. Karen nodded firmly. Langston extended a hand. She shook it. Then, To her surprise, Marcus spoke again. "One condition," he said. Karen turned toward him. "What?" "Marcus, you're flying with me." Karen blinked. "Wait, you're flying as a passenger?" Marcus chuckled. "Not quite. I'm shadowing your next flight. Call it one last test." Karen's stomach flipped. "And if I fail?" Marcus shrugged. "Then we'll have another conversation." Karen exhaled. "Fine. When?" Marcus leaned back. "Tomorrow morning." Karen nodded. Tomorrow, she would put everything she had learned to the test. For the first time, she didn't feel she felt ready. Karen adjusted her uniform in the mirror, smoothing out the crisp navy fabric. For the first time in over a month, she was stepping onto a plane and today, Marcus Johnson would be watching her. She refused to let that intimidate her. She had spent too many years pretending she had nothing to learn. Today, she was ready to prove, not to Marcus, not to the CEO, but to herself. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out of the crew lounge toward Gate 32. Her new beginning was about to take off. Karen stood at the entrance of the aircraft, greeting passengers as they stepped aboard. Her smile was genuine. Her tone was warm. She noticed the elderly woman who moved slowly, making sure she had assistance. She saw the nervous first-time flyer gripping his boarding pass too tightly and reassured him with a kind word. These were the things she never noticed before. And then, dressed in a sharp suit, he handed her his ticket with an unreadable expression. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," Karen said smoothly. "Welcome aboard." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You know, I almost expected you to double-check my seat." Karen, she met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "There's no need. You belong here." Marcus held her eyes for a beat longer. Then Karen felt but the flight had only just begun. Cruising at 35,000 feet, she had almost forgotten Marcus was there. Until he stood and walked toward her. "Miss Wallace," Marcus said, his voice carrying just enough weight for nearby passengers to hear. Karen straightened. Marcus gestured toward a seat in a passenger. A middle-aged man in business attire was arguing with a woman seated next to him. Marcus didn't explain further. He was testing her. Karen took a breath and approached. "Is everything all right here?" she asked gently. The businessman huffed. "I paid for a quiet flight. She won't stop talking to me." The woman, flustered, looked at Karen. "I was just making small talk. I didn't mean to bother anyone." Karen had handled 1,000 passenger disputes before. But today, she observed. And then she spoke. "Sir, I understand you'd like a peaceful flight," she said evenly. "Would you prefer a noise-canceling headset? Or would you like me to see if there's another available seat?" The man hesitated, thrown off by the options. Instead of Karen turned to the woman. "And ma'am, I completely understand wanting to be friendly. If you'd like, I can offer you a complimentary drink as an apology for the misunderstanding." The woman smiled, nodding. The businessman grumbled, but accepted the headset. Karen, she turned, and his expression? Impressed. As the plane touched down smoothly, Karen felt a relief. Satisfaction. She had done her job as passengers deplaned. Marcus was the last to leave. He stopped in front of her, adjusting his cufflinks. "Well?" Karen asked, folding her arms. "Did I pass?" Marcus studied her, his smirk returning. "Karen, this was never about passing," he said. "This was about who you are when no one's watching." Karen held his gaze. "And who am I now?" she asked quietly. Marcus smiled. "Someone worth flying with." With that, he stepped off the plane. And Karen Wallace? She stood taller. She was making things right. Karen Wallace thought she was simply doing her job until one flight changed everything. She misjudged a passenger, challenged the wrong man, and nearly lost her career. But in the end, the hardest lesson became the one that transformed her. This is a story of redemption, growth, and second chances. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like the video to support more great content. Comment your thoughts, we'd love to hear them. Subscribe for more powerful and thought-provoking stories. Thanks for watching.